I'm very pleased to take a call in part 2 of the Environment Canterbury Temporary Commissioners and Improved Water Management Amendment Bill. Mr Chairman, I want to begin really picking up the point that my colleague, Dr David Clark, recently promoted, well-deserved promotion, Member of Parliament for Dunedin North. I want to really pick up on the point that he concluded on, and that is the huge disappointment and anger that people in Canterbury feel about this legislation and the Primary Act that it's amending. I suppose the most important reason, the driving force for the disappointment and anger, is the fact that we trusted the Honourable Dr Nick Smith when he said publicly, consistently, strongly, and I'll quote, Mr Chairman, "Whatever the circumstances, the next regional council elections in Canterbury will take place no later than the elections scheduled for late 2013. We believed Honourable Dr Nick Smith. Now, some people think we may have been foolish believing him, but I'm old-fashioned enough to think that if a Member of Parliament says in this House or out in the public arena, if he's quoted in the media, if he says so on TV, on the radio, in the press, we should be able to believe them. But we have discovered that that was an absolute direct lie to the people of Canterbury, which has made us incredibly frustrated and angry. The anger was very evident, Mr Chairman, at the Select Committee hearings in Christchurch. The current Member of Parliament for Christchurch Central got very agitated during those hearings when members of the public, while presenting their submissions, got so upset and expressed it in very strong ways. I know that she's concerned about the impact of this legislation on her wafer-thin majority in Christchurch Central, because she's been polling recently. The poll that Nikki Wagner has conducted asked 6 questions, none of which directly related to this bill, but actually all of which arose as a result of this amendment legislation. Her poll in Christchurch Central asked how people were going to vote in the next election with their party vote and with their candidate vote. Did they know who the MP for Christchurch Central was? I'd love to see the result of that. I think a lot of them said, who cares? And then, in a very courageous move, she asked them to rate her. What did they think of her performance? I'd love to see the results of that too. And then she asked who they'd voted for in the last election, both in the party vote and the electoral vote. That poll will be reflecting the anger and frustration that Cantabrians feel at this legislation taking away not just our democratic right not to vote, not just making an absolute liar of the Honourable Nick Smith, which I think in itself is a pretty offensive thing for colleagues to do, but also takes away our water conservation orders, and that's referred to in Part 2, 517 2C, ECAN's powers and functions under Part 3. Mr Chairman, those are the reasons that Cantabrians are so angry. We're losing our vote. We've been lied to. We're very angry and frustrated and disappointed that we believed a minister who said we would have our right to vote back this year. We were angry that it was taken away, but we were assured, regardless of the circumstances, Nick Smith said, we'd have our vote back next year. And of course, we know that the submissions to the Select Committee were overwhelmingly reflective of the points that I'm making, of anger, of frustration, of extreme disappointment. Mr Chairman, there were 95 submissions received on this legislation, and 90 out of 95 were opposed to it. What bit of that maths is too hard for government members to understand? 90 out of 95 submissions said they didn't agree with it. People said it undermined their basic democratic rights. Well, that's actually not rocket science. That's the point of the legislation. The point of the legislation is to take away our democratic rights. The Chief Human Rights Commissioner was very upset, not just about the outcome of this legislation, but about the totally undemocratic process that it had undergone in which to be introduced. He talked about the Cabinet paper which accompanied the original Mr. Chairman, he talked about the Cabinet paper that accompanied the original legislation that actually specifically stated in the Cabinet paper that the deferral of what was then the 2010 election should be seen only as a temporary measure because of concerns that it constrained the right to public participation. Mr. Chairman, I suppose as a member from Canterbury, what I am most disappointed about is that the minister who took over from Nick Smith, who signed this paper off, is also a Cantabrian. I really thought that when the new minister, the Honourable Chris Tremaine, was given the job, that he might say, "You've got to be joking. Why would anyone in their right mind," and I've always assumed that he is actually in his right mind, why would any minister in their right mind want their name attached to this filth, this bit of dirt, this blight on the face of democracy? Why would any minister want their name attached to it? However, I suppose that's the price that you pay for getting into Cabinet. But I certainly know that other members would have said, no, enough. I'd rather make an honest man out of my colleague, the Honourable Dr. Nick Smith. Mr. Chairman, the final point I want to make is one I referred to earlier, and that's also alluded to in part 2, and that's the continuation of the removal of the water conservation order processes. Mr. Chairman, in the regulatory impact statement that accompanies this bill, on paragraph 45 on page 11, it says this: the water conservation order processes are set to return to those in the RMA because the special provisions are scheduled to lapse at the expiration of the Act. ECAN has advised it doesn't expect any more amendment applications with respect to the existing Canterbury water conservation orders and is not aware of any new applications for water conservation orders in the Canterbury region. Mr. Chairman, this is the critical bit. In the government's own regulatory impact statement, it says this: on this basis, the Ministry for the Environment, the Department of Internal Affairs and the Ministry of Primary Industries, three critical advisors to this legislation, say, consider there is insufficient justification for continuing special provisions for water conservation orders in the Canterbury region. Mr. Chairman, maybe the government was waiting for Moby to say it's all right to get back to proper processes under the Resource Management Act for water conservation orders. Maybe they were waiting for some sign for the stars to be in alignment. Frankly, there is very little else that could happen to give advice to ministers that this legislation is the wrong thing to do in regard to water conservation orders. Their own regulatory impact statement, unanimous advice from the Ministry for the Environment, Department of Internal Affairs and the Ministry of Primary Industries, saying this should not happen. And once again, we see ignorant, arrogant, dismissive, I don't know the correct adjective to use, because it just beggars belief to think that a minister in his right mind would ignore that advice, would ignore 90 out of 95 submissions, would ignore, I suspect, the pleading of the chair of the Select Committee, the current member for Christchurch Central, Nikki Wagner. I'm sure that she would have raised concerns about this bill, but if she raised concerns about this bill as quietly as she has raised concerns about Phillipstown School, no wonder this bill is going ahead, and no wonder Phillipstown School is scheduled to close at the end of the year. Mr. Chairman, this bill is a huge disappointment. It has caused anger and frustration for people in Canterbury. That was strongly expressed at the Select Committee. It has made a liar out of a minister who has recently been returned to Cabinet, and I personally am offended at that. I don't think there should be any attempt by this Parliament to position a Minister of the Crown into that position, and I'm sure the Honourable Nick Smith deeply resents it as well. This legislation just frankly should not proceed. It's wrong. In Canterbury, we've endured a lot, and we've shown how resilient we are. We're now asking for one request to be granted, and that is for our right to vote for our own regional council to be restored to us in the way that it was promised by the Honourable Nick Smith. It's not a big ask, and it's one that I want Parliament to reflect on.
Mr Chairman. Mr Chairman.
The Honourable David Parker. Mr Chairman, I want